So I saw a question on a Facebook group called Housing Advice Independent, which is a really good group. If you're looking to get information about your own situation, it's a really good group to get some help from. You can ask questions anonymously, and there's some really good admins in there who work very hard just to try their best to answer different questions across the housing kind of system. So it's not just homelessness they're looking at. And this question came from a mum who's living in a refuge with her daughter and had made a homeless application to a council, I don't know which council, and the councillor basically told her that she needed to provide a doctor's letter in order for them to progress the application. And the question was, in effect, what does the doctor need to write? And it's a very good question, because I can't see any situation at all where a doctor's letter would make any difference. They were already homeless because they were living in a refuge, and that is very much accommodation which is not reasonable to continue to occupy indefinitely. They were automatically in priority need because presumably they were homeless because of domestic abuse and there was a dependent child in the household. And I'm not quite sure what other situation would warrant or would need a doctor's letter to clarify their situation further in order for the council to progress their homeless application. But this leads to basically a really good question around councils using refuges, or councils relying on refuges as a discharge of Section 188 temporary accommodation. And just for those who haven't seen the video I've done before, I always reiterate these points really clearly. If you approach a council and you give them reason to believe you might be homeless, which includes being at risk of domestic abuse, and you ask them for help with housing, you immediately trigger what's called Section 184 of the Housing Act, which is the central duty to the homelessness part of the Housing Act, Part 7. And if you give the council reason to believe you might be homeless, might be eligible, might be in priority need, which most people who are experiencing domestic abuse would immediately do, the council has got an immediate duty to provide or secure that accommodation is made available to them. And as I say, councils will quite often try to steer people towards refuges as a way of getting out of this situation. In fact, the first case I ever dealt with at the organisation I set up with John Allen, called Just Us, was a lady in exactly that situation. She was told repeatedly that the council could not help her out directly. All they could do was to refer her to a refuge somewhere else in the country, and that's something in the circumstances that was simply not appropriate for her. And so she ended up getting compensation once we actually worked out what had happened and complained on her behalf. So it's something which I think is very, very common. And there are a few bits in the Code of Guidance which are relevant here. But before I go into it, I just want to clarify what a refuge actually is, because it might seem like a really obvious thing, but actually there are lots of charities, cowboy companies who are calling their accommodation, their supported accommodation often, they call them refuges when really they're not technically classed as refuges at all. Certainly I've seen people locally who are in this type of accommodation which says it's a refuge, but realistically there's hardly any staff on site. There are staff who are involved who might have a title of expert in domestic abuse or whatever, and really they've got very little understanding and experience at all, and they often kind of make things worse. So I've kind of worked with cases where actually individuals have been put in harm's way because these services are so sort of ramshackle and so shoddy. So it's just a point to make that if you are considering moving into a refuge, it's probably worth just asking, are you actually technically a refuge at all? What support is there? How often are staff on site? How safe is it? What are the safety measures here? How does the staff ensure that I'm kept anonymous and my location is kept anonymous and all that sort of stuff? So that's kind of something worth saying. I mean, I've never stayed in a refuge myself. I've worked with lots of people who've been through the refuge system, and generally speaking, they do not speak very highly of it. Even when they are technically refuges, these are often very kind of unpleasant environments, lots of people with lots of difficulties all shoved under one roof, and it becomes very difficult. I'd say it's almost a fool's errand for organisations to think they can really support people well for any length of time. And refuges are always supposed to be very short-term interventions, but you have people who are then trapped in these settings for very long periods of time because the staff there don't know housing law, they don't understand how homeless applications work, and therefore they think that they're actually limited options, when actually it should be pretty straightforward. If you're working in a refuge, you should be supporting pretty much all of your clients to make homeless applications, because it is often the default way out of homelessness itself, and there's often the most choice and the best quality accommodation at the end of the process which is going to be available to them. So that's the first thing to understand, is that not all refuges are actually refuges, but councils still can work very closely with refuges, and in fact the Code of Guidance actually says they should be working with local domestic abuse services, including refuges, as part of their overall strategy to deal with homelessness. So it's something which is kind of set in there, but there's a few interesting bits of the Code of Guidance which I'm just going to go through here, which kind of actually just elaborate on how this relationship should work. Because as I say, I think lots of councils out there will say, if you are saying you're at risk of domestic abuse, then your only option is to go into a refuge. And actually, if you look at 21.42 of the Code of Guidance, it says that for victims at risk of highly dangerous perpetrators, refuges will usually be the most appropriate choice. Refuges provide key short-term intensive support for those who flee from abuse. Given the intensity of the support and the vulnerability of the victims, attention should be paid to the length of time they spend in a refuge. Refuges are not simply a substitute for other forms of temporary accommodation, and the housing authority should work with the refuge provider to consider how long a person needs to stay there before provision of other accommodation. So just to make the point that if you approach a council and you trigger section 188, the council has an immediate duty to secure that safe, suitable, appropriate accommodation is made available for your occupation. And as I say, that will often eliminate refuges because often they're simply not that appropriate for certain people. And you know, if you look at the government stats on domestic abuse, there's something like 2 million people every year who are subject to domestic abuse, and I would therefore say that logically there are something like 2 million perpetrators of domestic abuse out there in the wild. The reality is that most of those perpetrators would not be classed as high risk. You know, when you're talking about high risk here, when it talks about highly dangerous perpetrators in the Code of Guidance, it's probably talking about here about perpetrators who are well known to the police. They may be under MAPA conditions. They probably have previous convictions for domestic abuse, all the kind of indicators that would say that actually these individuals present a very severe risk of harm. And often you have those quite extreme cases where perpetrators will literally, you know, they will cross the country to find the victim again and restart the abuse. So it's something which, you know, services actually I would say do quite a good job of dealing with. Not saying that it's always perfect, but I would say, and I guess in one sense I'm kind of speculating here about how this should be read, but I would say that the majority of perpetrators of domestic abuse do not fit that highly dangerous category. They are in one sense less likely to continue that abuse, and if they do continue the abuse, they're less likely to kind of be at that severe end of abuse. Now I appreciate that might have come across as quite clumsy. I'm trying my best here. It's a very complicated situation, but ultimately I'm hoping that kind of makes some sense. So the reality is that actually, whilst for some victims of domestic abuse it is, you know, appropriate for them to be housed 200 miles away, I would say that the majority of victims of domestic abuse they may well actually want to remain in the locality because they've got their jobs, their kids' schools, their family support networks all there, and they themselves are prepared to take that risk of the abuse continuing against the risk of being completely socially isolated. They prefer to remain at some sort of risk but be near those kind of support services and that support network than they are to be just housed in the middle of nowhere and have to kind of make a new life for themselves. So as I say, the Code of Guidance here is really just kind of making that point that actually refuges should not be the immediate go-to option for people who are making homeless applications because of domestic abuse. It needs to be a much more considered and much more fair-minded approach from housing authorities. Housing authorities tend, to kind of vilify them a little bit maybe and certainly simplify the situation. You have housing authorities which basically will kind of downplay abuse a lot because it then kind of means they don't have to take an application, and then when they do accept that there's enough risk, they'll suddenly say, well, this is the most risk they could possibly be at, so they need to be housed 300 miles away, because they know a lot of victims will turn that down, and then they can say, well, we did what we should have done, and it's the person's own fault for remaining in that situation or whatever, and that can often be used against that individual then in children's services meetings and those sort of settings, because they are then blamed for being at risk of abuse, which pretty unfair. So going back to this question that I saw in the Facebook group, ultimately, if you're in a refuge, you should be making a homeless application. You can make a homeless application to any council in the country. It makes sense to make a homeless application to the area you want to live in, and there's no point making an application really to another area if it is safe to live in your home area. Now, in domestic abuse situations, that's highly unlikely to be the case, but I'm saying it because technically you might have situations where that could be true. But ultimately, if I applied to a different local authority and I was at risk in my home area, the other authority could not refer me back to my home area, even if that was the only place I had local connection, because of the risk to me there. So that shouldn't ever happen. And ultimately, the receiving authority in that referral mechanism would simply say, we're not accepting it because that individual is at risk of domestic abuse here. So so if you're in a refuge, you make the homeless application via email. Don't ever do it in person, don't ever do it over the phone, always do it via email. And in that email, you just want to lay out the pertinent issues, the relevant issues. I'm in a refuge. That immediately gives the council reason to believe you might be in priority need through domestic abuse, and also reason to believe you might be homeless. You probably want to say just about your circumstances. Are you a British national? Do you have indefinite leave to remain? Has got settled status or whatever? And that is enough to trigger section 188 immediately. And it is entirely, you're entirely free to say to the council, look, I'm in a refuge, it's okay at the moment, I'm prepared to stay here for a little while longer whilst that homeless application gets processed. So you're already homeless, so the relief duty kicks in straight away. The prevention duty should not be mentioned in any way. So the relief duty kicks in, but you might say to them, look, I can stay here for another 2 months. And that gives you time, that gives the council time to get their inquiries done. It means they're in a position to make a decision on the 57th day. And ultimately that decision is going to owe you the main homelessness duty. And so basically at any point you can say, actually, I don't want to live here anymore. There are various good reasons for not wanting to live in a refuge, particularly in the long term. So you can then go back to the council and say, look, actually my circumstances have changed at the refuge, or they've given me notice to leave or whatever it is. And the council then has to provide you that temporary accommodation. So that's how it should work. And then, you're going to be into the grind of temporary accommodation through that process, waiting on the housing register, bidding on properties and all that sort of stuff. So if it's not already obvious, this whole process is unpleasant. This is not like a really good response to domestic abuse. It's better than nothing. It is hard on everyone involved. People living in those circumstances, the people then moving into temporary accommodation and so on, is hard. And it's made even harder, obviously, if councils are being stupid and asking for doctor's letters when there's actually no clear reason why that would be relevant. As I say, I can't see any relevance to that situation. Maybe there's something in that situation that is unique, but I don't think there is. So if you've got a council who's telling you, go and get a doctor's letter, and you're in a refuge, best bet is to try and find a staff member who knows what they're doing, who then can challenge the council to say, why are you asking for a doctor's letter? There's no need for a doctor's letter. What's the reasoning for it? And can you confirm you've already accepted the homeless application? As I say, the homeless application is accepted the minute you ask the council for help with housing and give them reason to believe you might be homeless. So, as I say, you want to do it in email, so you've then got a proof of the date you did that, and that's when the clock starts ticking. That's when your housing application is kind of in process, and basically the sooner you do it, the quicker you're going to get housed in that final settled accommodation. I hope that helps. If you haven't already and you like this sort of content, or you certainly find it interesting and useful, please do subscribe to the channel. Do like the video. Do share it with people who you think might be interested in it as well, because there are a lot of myths out there, and there are a lot of professionals who don't actually know what the law is, and consequently they mean really well. They can be very nice and everything, but ultimately they may not actually be exploring options to you which are actually going to be your best option, and they should really be walking through that process with you, because lots of housing officers out there in councils are not very pleasant people. So it's a real lottery. Some are really nice and some aren't. And ultimately, it shouldn't be you having to face that on your own. You should be having professionals around you who are willing to fight for you and to kind of help you through that.